Coming up in this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we respond to your comments on our last episode where we talked about the freight train preference hoax. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly, soon to be thrice weekly, excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who's very well adept at stirring up a lot of controversy, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the first time this week, and over 24 hours late, I am blessed to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Thank you so much for all of your patience. I know that we've had a great few days out there on the internet, been chasing a lot of trains. We've been doing a lot of really great things here at the All Aboard Podcast. And so I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being such great, supporters and being with us as we try to figure out how to get this together. And we will continue to make this podcast better every time. So just a little programming note. We will now be doing 3 days a week, normally Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The Friday episode will just be a little bit of a news recap of what happened in the industry the preceding week. And we're also going to get into some of the stock-related information that you might be seeing out there about railroads and some of their most important customers. So that way you can better understand how the railroad is working, who they are serving, and how the machinations of the marketplace are going to impact you. Now, we are here to talk about last week's second episode, which was episode 51, Time for a Clapback, Debunking the Freight Preference Hoax. Now, in that episode, I responded to a video by Wendover Productions, which was entitled The Tiny Law That Keeps Amtrak Terrible. And I did that because, quite frankly, it was over 23 minutes of falsehoods and half-truths and so on, and it really did serve to make it difficult for somebody either who's a layperson, who's an enthusiast, who's a policymaker, or who is an experienced railroader to understand a lot of the factors that are out at play with respect to Amtrak trains and even with respect to via rail passenger trains as they operate over host railroads, and why you have a situation where we have a very, very strong and robust freight rail network, and our passenger rail network seems to be rather anemic by contrast. Now, I want to start by mentioning something that's very important to me, and I hope that you understand this. See, I'm a believer, as much as I love trains and passenger trains in particular, of course, freight trains as well. I'm a big believer that the trains have to be run for someone else, right? It have to be run for someone else. If we have a train, we have a beautiful railroad, we have the best locomotives, we have terrific cars, we have outstanding track, and it's really just me and maybe a couple of you that actually want to ride it, it's not really worth much. It represents a bad use of our money. It represents a bad use of real estate. It represents a bad use of resources overall. And most importantly, it is not sustainable, because here's the reality. When you're looking at everything that it takes to have a railroad, and we're talking about the real estate under the track, we're talking about the ballast that makes up a portion of the track structure itself. Then let's talk about the locomotives, the passenger cars, the freight cars, the signal system, positive train control and overlay on the signal system in places like the Northeast Corridor, where you have a extensive catenary network to support electrification. And then let's talk about the people who work aboard the trains, the engineers, the conductors, the diesel mechanics, the electricians, all of them. And that's just a small portion. What about on a long distance trains? The people who work the bar car, the people in the dining car, the folks who are porters in the sleeping cars, almost call them Pullmans for a second there, the coach attendants. All of those people matter, and all of them have a cost. The folks that keep the stations up, the people who operate the stations, all of that. Who maintains the Wi-Fi and makes sure that it continues to operate so that you can surf the internet while you're riding the train? Or how about the people who provide the food that's served in the dining cars? Operating a railroad is a very, very expensive endeavor. And the reality is that if we're going to continue to have trains, what we need is for those trains to be, number one, robustly patronized, and number two, there must be a solid capital base with someone willing to spend the money And that's an important distinction in order to have that. And the video that Wendover put out, it completely distorts it. First of all, the people who are willing to spend the money on railroads are often private investors. That is 99% of who puts money into railroads in this country. And without private investment, there would be no Union Pacific, no Great Northern, no Central Pacific, no Southern Pacific, Missouri Pacific, Missouri, Kansas, Texas, Erie, Lackawanna, New York, Central Pennsylvania, Seaboard Coastline, and so on. They wouldn't be there. It was the majority of the money that went in there was private capital that created it. And the effort to demonize private capital and say that, well, investors are somehow not necessary, or they're just fat cats that deserve to be screwed at every point, really undermines our ability to build successful passenger and freight railroad networks. And that is one of the big reasons why you have seen very little in the way of efforts to develop private passenger rail outside of tourist rail since May 1st, 1971, because that level of demonization is what was going on in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s as the railroads were struggling with declining patronage and simply the enormity of costs that it took to operate railroads, passenger trains in particular, in a time when just about every form of traffic was leaving. And let's remember something else, because we're going to discuss this a little bit more extensively. For those who are absolutely strong advocates of the government taking over the railroads, taking the infrastructure away, and just feeding those private investors to a bloody pulp, let's remember something. Remember that one of the big drivers to the creation of Amtrak actually came from the government, the United States Post Office Department. It was the Post Office Department at the time. It's the United States Postal Service now. Decided that it was going to end the RPOs, the railway post offices that were aboard passenger trains. These were often the last legs that held up a lot of the passenger trains and continued to operate for the small number of people who wanted to travel on them in the late 1960s. And then the Post Office Department said, we are done, we are leaving. They left. So the same people who you are hoping are going to come along and give you a paradise of trains and just make everything perfect, they are very much fickle. And this is not for the purpose of making a political conversation out of government good, private bad. It's to understand that the way you have success in a capital-intensive industry is to develop a strong private capital base, because private capital is very, very patient in comparison to public capital that needs to show returns on a 2-year, 4-year, or 6-year basis that goes with election cycles. And that is the reason why we have the successful freight railroad network that we have, and also why we have a very unsuccessful network of regional and long distance passenger trains that we call Amtrak. And by the way, we are not the only one that is dealing with that, because just north of the border in Canada, and we've talked about this in one of the episodes previously as well, Via Rail Canada, it became a crown corporation, which is basically their version of a publicly held, and I don't mean publicly held in the stock traded sense, but publicly held as in by the government being the parent of that, became a crown corporation. It took over Canadian National and Canadian Pacific's passenger trains. They operated them for as long as it was politically feasible. Once it no longer was, they dramatically cut the service, and it has never rebounded since. But as they said at the time, we'll be able to cut these trains and soon no one will know. And even today, it generally only is railroad advocates who will go back and talk about what happened in the past and why there is so little via rail service given the size of the nation of Canada. Now, what I wanted to do is go through some of the comments that we received on that video, because some of those are very, very instructive and help us better understand not only the railroad itself, but also the mentality surrounding passenger service and freight rail service. So let's get to it. Now, starting on Facebook in the passenger train enthusiast group, I was very happy. And by the way, that's a great group. So if you're out there, I do encourage you to join it. The discussion there is very, very robust. So I think you'll enjoy it there. The first of all, my favorite, Tony Berzio. Tony said, this is the best video I've ever seen on railroads, bar none. Tony, thank you. Shout out to you. I'm going to send you a message over Facebook, and you will have a free lifetime membership to All Things Trains. Yes, sometimes that's all it takes. But there were a little bit more in-depth comments, nothing against you, Tony, but a little bit more in-depth that go to my point here. And that comes from Daniel Lewis. And Daniel Lewis said, if freight rail had tracks as straight as that take, meaning mine, every train would be delayed for heat like the Adirondack all the time. So that lets us talk about the Adirondack and Daniel Lewis's take. And by the way, we've invited Daniel to come on with us several days ago, and he still has not responded as of this time. But Daniel, if you're watching, you're certainly welcome to join and share your thoughts on what I have to say on the air with me, and we can have a very good debate. Now, let's talk about the Adirondack. The Adirondack started running in the early 1970s, and this train is what's called a 403B section train. Now, Section 403B is what allows the states to fund Amtrak services. And by fund, I mean subsidized. The first 403B train of note was the Lake Shore. Now, not the Lake Shore Limited, but the Lake Shore. And this train operated between New York and Chicago. And I believe it was in 1972. Fact check me on that, but I believe it was 1972 and into 1973, and only operated relatively briefly. That train operated over the New York Central between Grand Central Terminal and Union Station in Chicago, because by that point, LaSalle Street had ceased to be a long-distance passenger terminal. It only operated for a short time, and that was only as long as New York and Ohio were willing to fund it. And that's interesting to note that for as big as passenger service was over the former New York Central Main Line, which, by the way, serves Albany, Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Erie, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, and Toledo in Ohio, and then Elkhart in South Bend, Indiana, before getting to Chicago. So a lot of population centers, and that was one of the reasons why the New York Central and its great steel fleet did so much business and operated so many trains over that line, whether between the endpoints of New York and Chicago or to intermediate locations such as Buffalo, like the Empire State Express, Cleveland, and then going down on the Big Four to Columbus, out to St. Louis, and so on. So that was a very important area where Amtrak provided relatively scant service early on. So operating the Lakeshore was important. Another one of those 403B trains, though, is the one that we're really talking about here, which is the Adirondack, which shared that same route between Grand Central Terminal and the Albany-Schenectady area before turning on to the Delaware and Hudson and going to Montreal. This train had been operated, or a train under that name had been operated by the Delaware and Hudson in combination with the New York Central before Amtrak, and it also had a counterpart that ran overnight called the Laurentian. And so this was part of a very long tradition of services that we've discussed before, including the Montrealer and otherwise, that connected Americans in that mid-Atlantic region where New York City is with Montreal, which has long been not only a vacation spot, but has been an economic hub and one of the two largest economic hubs for Canada. And certainly, of course, a very unique place to visit. And for the rail enthusiasts out there, I encourage you, if you have not gone to Montreal, please go there. Unfortunately, for the next 8 months, you will not be able to take the Adirondack there, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, the Adirondack was subsidized by the state of New York, but not just in money form. It was actually subsidized with equipment. So if you've ever heard of the term PA4, which was, and we're going to try to get a picture up here on CP5 cam, these were locomotives that had been purchased by the Delaware and Hudson from General Electric in the 1960s, and they were refurbished using money from the state of New York for service on the Adirondack. Now, I know we're always taking our lives in our hands here whenever we try to figure out if we're going to be able to get a picture on this podcast. But voila, there it is. Those are 3 of the PA4s at that point in the picture that you see on CP5 cam. They had not yet been rebuilt. These were former Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Alco PAs. And the state of New York put money into them to upgrade them to Alco 251 engines, improve their electrical gear, which came from General Electric, and make them much more reliable than they had been, even though they were considered to be very strong performers. In addition, the state funded the use of Delaware and Hudson passenger equipment, so the train very much did look a lot like this, although typically you'd only have one locomotive and a small set of cars, and that included dome cars that were borrowed from Canadian Pacific, coming from its fleet that it utilized on the Canadian and Dominion at the time. And remember, in this time, CP was still operating its trains privately north of the border between Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver being the primary routing that they served, although they had several along with that. Now, later on, Amtrak, unfortunately, replaced those with turboliners, which, you know, nowadays in 2024, we'd love to have the turboliners back, but frankly, they couldn't match in any way in terms of the comfort and otherwise that the Delaware and Hudson equipment did. And this is also how the D&H equipment, including the PAs themselves, ended up getting sent to Mexico, which I know some people are very upset about, but I'm personally very happy about because that actually saved their lives a second time. Bearing in mind that had they not been saved the first time by the D&H, they would have been cut up by General Electric. And later on, had they not been saved after Carl B. Sturzing, Bruce Sturzing, who was running the Delaware and Hudson for the Norfolk and Western, who owned the carrier through Derico, had he not been such a strong-willed person and willing to take chances and doing some interesting things that perhaps his parent company may not have wanted to do themselves, all of that would have gone out the window as well. And that also includes the shark nose locomotives, the RF-16s, that are now owned by a private owner, but are preserved thanks to that as well. Anyway, the PAs got leased out to the MBTA in Boston and later on sent down to Mexico, where they stayed, where two of them remain operable and two have been returned to the United States. But this is the story of the Adirondack. Now, the Adirondack operates over the Delaware and Hudson, which is owned by Canadian Pacific, between Schenectady, New York, and Rouse's Point, New York, right along Lake Champlain, and provides very beautiful views of a lot of that. So you'll go through some of the area where you had the Olympics in the I think it was the late 1970s, and then go on up to Montreal. However, once you get to Rouse's Point, New York, the train leaves the Delaware and Hudson, and rather than getting on the Naperville Junction Railway, which was a D&H subsidiary and carried the train in the past, in the pre-Amtrak era and early in the Amtrak era, to Windsor Station in Montreal, which was the Canadian Pacific's facility and is now the location of the Bell Center. And I love the fact that there's a train station at the Bell Center. I know it's not really named for me, it's named for Bell Canada, but you don't have to tell anybody that. I mean, after all, why wouldn't you name a train station, arena at a train station for me, right? But rather than serve there, Amtrak wanted to serve Central Station, which is where Via Rail services operate out of, because the only other services that operate out of the Bell Center or Louisiana-Allier, which is what Windsor Station is now called, are commuter services to various regions that are provided by EXO, formerly AMT. Now, in order to do that, they had to utilize Canadian National's Rouse's Point subdivision, which is about 42 miles of track that has a 50-mile-per-hour speed limit on it. From the Rouse's Point subdivision, you pull onto the St. Hyacinth sub. That is what gets you almost to Central Station itself. Now, the Rouse's Point subdivision is very much a bone of contention, and that is what is being referred to by the commenter Daniel Lewis when he talks about the Adirondack and the heat restrictions. Canadian National has in recent years put pretty substantial heat restrictions on the Rouse's Point subdivision during the summer when the temperatures get up over about 80, 85 degrees. This is something that I have known them to do in other situations, most notably the Algoma Central. And this is something that really should be viewed as much more of a as an internal approach to safety, which I think may be misguided, but is certainly something that is being driven by their understanding and their approach to how they would like to handle the issue of heat kinks. Now, to be clear, the Rouse's Point subdivision is certainly an appendage of the Canadian National that is not central to their operations. And it would make much more sense for someone like Amtrak or the New England Central or a combination of the two to actually purchase this line and operate it, because the majority of the traffic that runs over it is actually the New England Central's freight that's coming off of that carrier and being interchanged with the Canadian National. And second to that is, of course, Amtrak operating the twice daily Adirondack over this. But the reason why this is instructive is not just because we get a chance to go through the history of the Adirondack or investigate the infrastructure in southern, or I should say southeastern Quebec, but it is also because this is an issue that Amtrak runs into fairly frequently that many of the commenters and many rail passenger advocates do not seem to understand. And it is that the reality is, in order for the railroad to be successful, someone is going to have to pay the cost. Now, if Canadian National is going to go out and make the repairs they want to make on their own, they will have to generate enough traffic to cover that cost. And twice daily Amtrak trains, even if Amtrak was paying more money, would not begin to do that. And let's talk about what those costs are. We start with the subgrade. The subgrade has to be prepared. That often means either in-house or hired contractors to come out and adjust the subgrade. And you've probably seen this happen with a lot of earth movers, backhoes, and so forth. That must be solid in order to have a good basis for the track. Then on top of that, you build up the ballast. That also has a cost to it. Not only are we talking about the people that have to come out and do the work, but we're talking about obtaining thousands of tons of that rock and transporting it there, which will primarily be done by train, but has a cost even though this is being done internally. Then all that has to be laid. That often requires, you guessed it again, the earth movers and whatnot, because usually if you're doing substantial track work, you're going to have the train out of the way. So you're going to be taking it out of those hopper cars and putting it down and spreading it. Then you build the track structure on top of that. That includes a substantial number of machines, including tampers and otherwise, that are going to come out and handle that, not to mention what it takes to actually get those railroad ties and put it down. Then on top of that, you've got your tie plates, your rail, and spikes and so on. So the OTM, other track material that goes into it. And then it is making sure that everything is level the way it's supposed to be. All of this takes thousands of dollars, in many cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars, or even millions of dollars, depending on how much of that work is going to be done. And for those of you who are out there that say, well, you know, it has to be done, it's in the public interest, you have to do this, the railroads have an obligation to do it. Tell me if you think that the people who are being paid to do this work, many of whom are union employees, are obligated to work for just whatever you think is reasonable to pay, or if you're not willing to pay at all. And tell me if the shareholders who provide the funds, which are primarily pension funds and mutual funds, and that's most of us that have 401ks where that mutual fund money comes from, if we should be obligated to do that, when someone like Amtrak and to a lesser extent New England Central don't see a reason to invest the money that they have or the resources they have access to in order to do that. So the idea that railroads at Canadian National in particular on the Adirondack line or other carriers in other places are going to need to put money in simply because of the nebulous idea of the public interest, or because sometime long ago they received right-of-ways or land grants or otherwise, what that does is diminishes all of what is provided by the people who make this possible. And all those are primarily a lot of blue-collar workers, plus a lot of the white-collar workers who are in the offices who help to manage it from a financial and a marketing standpoint. Without that, there are no trains, and therefore, a lot of the beliefs that we're somehow paid off by the Class 1 railroads, or which I think is very funny, and we'll get back to that in a little bit, or that railroads are somehow obligated to serve a nebulous public interest when there is absolutely no resources being provided by the public, is absolutely erroneous and is a great example of why passenger trains in the United States do not in any way compare to what people would like for passenger trains in the United States to be. Now, I will move over to some of the comments on YouTube, which were also very interesting, and I will pause that. That's just me talking there. So one of the people here, Daniel Lewis 1789. Daniel, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it, and appreciate the fact that you added 12 comments to this. So you really did, you were fairly prolific. But we'll start with the first one I see, where you said, building out the Western network with land grants reflects a shockingly liquid capital environment with substantial support from the feds and the states, which was Wendover's point. The reality is the capital environment was not shockingly liquid, and that is the reason why you had monies being invested by localities, states, and the federal government. But let's also remember, while I personally am opposed to any kind of public investment in private transportation, part of the reason why a lot of these investments did come from public sources is because those public sources wanted the railroad to go through their town. And the railroads would often go to the towns and say, hey, how much money can you give us in order to build here? Now, there were two parts to that. First of all, the goal was to make a profit. That's why the railroad was being built. And of course, part of making a profit is, can you make a profit building the enterprise? The answer is absolutely you can. So fundraising by asking communities along the lines and states in order to chip in order to get it. That was one way that the early railroad builders did make money. And that was important. Number two, the second reason is because, as I mentioned in our previous video, in the West, a lot of the land was owned by the federal government anyway. So let's think about that for a second. If the federal government owns the land because they bought it or they won it in a war, in order to get the land, the railroad would have to go to the federal government and buy it from the federal government. However, they had no incentive to do so because at the time, pretty much all you had there were Indian tribes, many of whom were hostile, and so certainly weren't going to be customers on the railroad, at least not the hostile ones. You didn't have development, so you needed a way to facilitate development, and people were not necessarily inclined to naturally go do this and build businesses and build communities in large numbers unless there was an orderly way for them to do it. So one way this was accomplished was by providing land grants to the railroads, which they then resold to settlers along the way. This is what helped to build businesses and build communities that would utilize the railroad. The railroad was much better at this because as a private business, they were able to take their infrastructure, which they were already using in order to develop the railroads in areas that were somewhat populated, in order to do the same thing. So they had tools that the federal government, as well as state and local governments, didn't have at their jurisdiction. So, Daniel, I would encourage you to read a fair amount of the books. And one of them, we talked about earlier, Rio Grande, along the Rio Grande, does outline how a lot of this settlement typically took place. And it'll be very eye-opening for you to see the reality of that, as opposed to the whitewashed history that you typically get when we're talking about the development of the Western United States. A second comment that Daniel had says, and I quote, a core part of railroad monopoly was, for about a century, providing twin benefits to the public, movement of cargo and movement of people. If a railroad owner isn't willing to provide both, why should they be allowed to benefit from literal taking of other people's property, and in parentheses, eminent domain and land grants used to build their right-of-way? Well, first of all, as I've just outlined, Daniel, the point of the land grants was to develop the region, which was not developed, to facilitate settlement of the region. Also, let's not forget, because I mentioned a lot of the Indian tribes, it was also to tame the region. So the railroad was a useful tool in order to do this, and providing the land grants to them was was one of the benefits of that to the government itself. Now, the railroads provide benefits to the public simply by moving freight, because the freight has to be moved anyway, and therefore if the railroads are able to do it, and they're able to do it without relying on public infrastructure, that is a benefit to the public. What's notable, though, is that what you're trying to do there is determine what you want the benefits to be. You want to unilaterally determine what the benefits are. You would like to say, well, I want passenger trains. Okay, well, the railroads are actually willing to provide you passenger trains, so long as you're willing to ride the passenger trains. But as we've talked about, and you can see in a myriad of sources, simply by looking at the numbers, too many of your fathers and grandfathers were not willing to ride the passenger trains. Too many of your fellow Americans today are not willing to ride the passenger trains. in the numbers to support the type of service that a small number of people are seeking. If that changes, and that change could be driven by technological innovation on the side of the railroad, that change could be driven simply by a change of attitudes, actually, as we're seeing right here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where Amtrak services are seeing actual record ridership, not simply the combination of cutting services and combining it into one, but actual record ridership growth, where people have said, okay, you know what? We cannot expect the government to improve the highways, which are heavily congested like I-95. Therefore, we are going to take advantage of train service that's being offered, and therefore service has been increased thanks to the increased patronage. So that is an explanation of the twin benefits that will be provided if the twin benefits are desired. But if there are not enough of you to populate the trains in order to make them profitable and make it so that reinvestment can take place, then the trains will not run. And one more thing that is very important. There's also a steadfast belief among a number of people that if a benefit is granted to you or something is paid to you at one point, that you are going to be forever indebted, and therefore you are due to be conscripted for whatever that person or the government or otherwise wants anytime in your life. That is something I completely reject. And again, going back to what we were saying before, where railroads provided benefits to the public equal in terms of what the public provided to the railroads in terms of settlement, development, and so forth. So therefore, I find your argument there to be absolutely moot. Moving down here a little bit further, you say erratic, inconsistent, and whatever scheduling definitely describes PSR. It describes, quote, not having track slots when low single-digit trains operate on the line, etc. What I want to point out about track slots is that track slots have a value. Now, think of them the same way as airports have takeoff and landing slots. And therefore, the value of those slots, because they are finite, has to be maximized. If a railroad, whether we're talking about the BNSF, the Union Pacific, CSX or otherwise, is going to give Amtrak a slot, Amtrak needs to pay more than what the railroad is going to be able to earn on it by providing that service by themselves. Because let's remember, if CSX says, okay, Phil, let's say I'm the person that's doing this instead of Amtrak, we will give you slots to run your passenger train between Washington, D.C. and Miami, Florida over our railroad. And I say, all right, that's great. And I pay them $2 per car mile. Now, what happens when UPS comes along and they say, hey, we want to throw on another intermodal train between the Washington, D.C. area and Miami because we have a growing lane. And what they're going to pay is $20 per car mile. And CSX tells them, well, we'd really love to host you. We really would. But, we gave that slot to Phil and he's paying us $2 per car mile. Now, what do you think is going to happen? Well, first of all, they're going to be upset and they'll be missing out on $18 per car mile that they could be earning. And that is a much better use because all of that $18 per car mile is going back in to benefiting the company, whether we're talking about dividend payments, which is what keeps capital in the company and able to be invested in the infrastructure itself, or in the infrastructure itself, or even in the employees. So all of those things are where that $18 that would be foregone would be going, and all those are important things. But let's also remember the shippers, most of whom serve you and I, in this case UPS, by carrying our property, packages and so forth from point A to point B, have just as much a right to access the railroad as you do. And if they're told, you know what, we're not going to run your trains, well, as you've probably seen, they go directly to the Surface Transportation Board and talk about how railroad service is not meeting their needs. So you have to ask, is it worthwhile in order to disadvantage what can be thousands of people who are being benefited by the UPS service because they're able to ship their packages and their freight that way, in order for a small number of people who cannot or will not pay anywhere near what it costs to maintain the infrastructure? How is the public interest being served by catering to that small number of people and disadvantaging a much larger number of people? That is the reason why we look to the marketplace and market incentives to determine what runs. And again, if there's a small number of you who aren't willing to pay or aren't able, then you should find another mode of transportation. And I say that as a lover of passenger trains and somebody who very much would love for things to go back to the way they were in the 1940s and the 1950s, when I could go out and hop on the Silver Star one day, the Nancy Hanks 2 another day, the Broadway Limited a third day, and the City of Los Angeles the fourth day. Now, another comment from Daniel Lewis is, public transit doesn't have a mechanism to capture the value it creates external to the station. Positive externalities are Econ 101 and a basic part of building modern, parentheses, AKA since the invention of mass transit cities. This is why government subsidized passenger rail, because it's a net benefit. Frankly, your refusal to understand this calls into question any other opinion you might have about passenger rail. This comment is really emblematic of a lot of the problems that we have in general with understanding the interaction between the individual desire and the public, what are quote unquote public benefits. Now, there is no such thing as a positive externality or the way to capture value external to the station. You capture the value for what it is that you provide. If there is any value beyond that, somebody else is going to capture it, and it is up to them to do so. Governments do not subsidize passenger rail because it is a net benefit. Governments subsidize passenger rail because there was a demand at one time for some of the passenger rail to continue. In other cases, government subsidized passenger rail simply because they made it so difficult for the private sector to provide the passenger rail in the first place. And that is largely why a lot of your commuter services, especially in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and so on, are subsidized, because there were a variety of pieces of legislation, whether it's related to property taxation, whether it is related to rules related to for unions and otherwise, that made those services incredibly expensive to provide. And also, there were rules that were holding down the ability of the railroad to realize that value in terms of what fares were being charged. Having the ability to get rid of those is one of the things that's allowed the public passenger rail operators to be successful. And I'll just give you a great example. What is one of the things that helps to keep Amtrak's sleeping cars full? Well, it's their ability to charge as much as they possibly can get in the times that they're able to do it. That way, they get sleeping cars, they get revenue, they're able to modulate the demand, and so on. Their private ancestors were not able to do this. So the idea that public transit can't capture the value it creates external to the station, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to capture the value for what it provides to the riders. That's it. That's the only thing. That's the same thing for any other business. I mean, think about this. How does Kellogg's, when they make cereal, capture the value that's external to the cereal box? Are they supposed to try to somehow get some of my raise? Well, maybe in selling me more cereal. You know, if I get a raise at work, maybe in selling me more cereal, but that's about it. And the same goes for a transit operator or otherwise. So the failure to understand this, again, contributes to why we have such a difficulty in growing passenger rail here in the United States. And the last one that I will highlight here from Daniel Lewis, 1789, where he says, your entire tirade about track conditions entirely missed the point. Wendover was referring to long trains and slow trains and short sidings, not track conditions. I struggle to see where Wendover was getting something about that right versus where I was getting something wrong. The point that Wendover made is that track conditions were in poor shape. That's explicitly what they say. They say track conditions are in poor shape. But the reality is track conditions are in the best shape that they have been in decades. And like I said, you can see that simply by going out to a railroad, taking a look at what you see, taking a look at an employee timetable, seeing the speeds the freight trains are operated at, and seeing the speeds that the passenger trains are operating at. Now, if we're talking about the lengths of sidings, let's also remember, again, as new technology is implemented, and this being distributed power, that makes it possible to have longer trains. Therefore, there will be a time that the sidings have to catch up. Now, should a railroad say, well, we're not going to run the longer trains or not take advantage of what we have while we wait for the sidings to be expanded? Well, some might choose to do that. That has happened in some cases. But If Amtrak or other passenger rail operators are concerned about siding length impacting their ability to provide the service, well, then it is up to them to invest the money in order to do that. And let's not forget, with a few small exceptions, and these being a small number of private passenger operators like Rocky Mountaineer, most of them are tourist related, the people who run passenger trains have access to tax dollars, but they are generally unwilling to spend this money in any substantial way to reach what they're hoping to in terms of passenger rail. They're willing to spend those dollars in large amounts on highways. They're willing to spend those dollars in large amounts on airways, but they are not willing to invest substantially in passenger rail. If you have a problem with that, you should look at the people you elect to office, because they are the ones who make that decision. Don't go to the railroad and say, well, the railroad is evil because they will not meet the desires of me in facilitating a service that they don't make any money from and they don't have any part of, simply because I want it. That's called selfishness. There's a reason why we try to grow out of being selfish after we're children. And so, Daniel, your assertion about this certainly falls on deaf ears here at the All Aboard podcast. And I'm going to include one more before we get out of here. And this comes from another person, the one comment that Daniel Lewis 1789 didn't make. And this comes from Bill Blom. And Bill says, DPUs are a mixed bag. I'm near the A line that CSX operates. A year plus a bit ago, I noticed a freight stopped on the main. Turns out it was going into one of the many mile-long sidings south of Four Oaks. The reason it was stopped? A pair of pull-aparts, one of which was in front of the DPU, many cars ahead, and one behind, several cars back. Figure about a 1.5 mile long train where couplers got pulled out of their pockets and/or had a broken knuckle. About a quarter of the train was in the siding. The failure happened at about 5:30 or 6, and the train started moving again at 8 or 9 that evening. They had to call for help from the maintenance yard about 50 miles north. They were trying to figure out if it was PTC or engineer error, last I heard. That said, trains have stopped blocking Four Oaks and its 4 crossings several times when they had to reboot locomotives to get the PTC hooked again. After 20 minutes, that intermodal finally started moving. The passenger service that was supposed to go by Four Oaks got a significant delay, and on the pull-apart, there was no way around that mess. That said, I've been on Amtrak more than once years ago, where the train actually arrived early in Chicago, caused the folks in the Acela Lounge to have heart attacks. Well, this is just the reality of being on a railroad. And pull-aparts happen whether you have distributed power or not, and they're actually more common when you have the locomotives packed at the front of the train than when you do distribute them throughout the train. And that is the point of distributed power, which is to reduce a lot of the forces that come about and improve train handling by spreading the power out throughout the train. Now, as Bill Blom mentioned, there are factors that will come about, such as positive train control, which was a terrible idea. And here at the All Aboard podcast, we have pointed out why it made absolutely no sense for the federal government to mandate an untested and non-existent technology that is developed for more of a controlled environment than a railroad. Because remember, traditional railroads that operate outside, not in tunnels, and they have train consists that differ by the day. And that can be more gondolas one day, loaded flat cars the next, box cars, you name it when we're talking about freight. And the same with passenger trains, where there rarely is a fixed consist outside of a small number of trains such as a Acela Express and some of your diesel multiple unit consists. And even there, you can see variations in both, because there is possibility to make an Acela train one car longer, as occasionally does happen, or add and subtract DMU units to some of those trains. Positive train control, for all the technology that was employed to build it, is not really capable of doing this. And the only reason the so-called technology exists is by federal mandate, which was a knee-jerk reaction to a passenger train being operated improperly, a government-owned passenger train, I should add, being operated improperly by a contractor that was not properly being supervised by its contracting agency. And that is the reason for the Chatsworth wreck in the early 2000s, which ultimately led to the positive train control mandate and a lot of the problems that Bill Blom has outlined here. But even beyond that, again, this is something that's possible without positive train control being in force. And freight trains or passenger trains can end up running into a variety of problems, whether we're talking about with brake hoses, overheating wheel bearings, or otherwise, that can slow down their trip, and that can result in some kind of a stoppage that delays other trains. Sometimes the passenger train delaying the freight train, other time it's the freight trains delaying the passenger trains. So I hope you have enjoyed my clapback to the clapback to the clapback here on the All Aboard podcast. And as always, I thank you with some of the difficulties that we've had recently in terms of getting the schedule right. I want to just give you a little background. I've started now to work for myself, so getting the schedule on track has been a little bit difficult, but we will be able going forward to have consistency and stick more or less with that Monday, Wednesday, Friday show that starts between 12 and 1 and usually runs for about 30 to 45 minutes. So thank you so much for being with us here at the All Aboard podcast. It's always a pleasure to talk trains with you, and even to those with whom I disagree, and even disagree stridently in some cases. Thank you for listening to this show and being a part of it, and we hope you will continue to do so. And always, as always, share your thoughts with us, because that is how we all are able to learn more about this great industry and enjoy everything out there. So we will see you back here tomorrow on Wednesday, and I hope you have a great afternoon.